Welcome back. In part 1, I designed a nice jack-o'-lantern in FreeCAD. Now it needs to be sliced for printing. So now that we have our jack-o'-lantern, it's a good idea to put it in the slicer and make sure we've got something printable. So I'll select the jack-o'-lantern and the stem and export them as a step file. Now go into Prusaslicer and load the step file into the build plate. It's notable here that due to improvements in slicers, especially the ability to read in a step file, that unlike in my previous videos, it is no longer necessary to create registrations and go through the step of aligning the pieces. The slicer already aligned everything in its correct place. Note that since there were two distinct entities in the step file, they're listed as separate objects in the panel on the right. It is perfectly willing to let the stem hover in space if I change the jack-o'-lantern to a non-printing type. Moving along, I'm not at all surprised that there are stability issues. Note the entire upper lip and teeth of the jack-o'-lantern are impossible to print without supports. They're beyond an overhang, since the correct placement of the upper lip and upper teeth is actually in midair, supported from above by material that will not have been printed yet. So I turn on supports, and it's defaulting to the old style supports, which in my experience are very nearly impossible to successfully remove without damaging the teeth. So I'll switch this over to organic supports. I'll keep rectilinear and go back to the plater. Here we have supports on the upper lip, but for some reason it appears to have left the teeth out. In addition, I'm not convinced the stem really needs supports, especially since I'm not that concerned if it's not perfectly neat. It's a small piece that would be hard to notice, and most pumpkins are not cut from the vine with surgical precision in any event. I can solve these problems by painting on support blockers and support enforcers. I'll start by painting on some blockers under the stem by using the right mouse button. And I see that we have definitely gotten rid of the supports there. Now using the left mouse button, I can apply support enforcers to the teeth. I want to make sure to cover the whole area that's going to need supporting, including the little bits in the back. Returning to the slice preview and looking layer by layer, it's clear that we have good support now. This will print fine. But if I want to be sure about the stem, I do have the option to bring it back into CAD, go into the sketch for the sweep path and shorten up the arc just a little bit. Force it to be perpendicular to the top of the pumpkin. Force it to be centered. This looks good for the stem. It might be just a little bit better for printing as it avoids any part of the stem reaching 90 degrees overhang. So now it's just a matter of re-exporting and then slicing it again. The slicer tells me it cannot reload the step file, but that's okay. I can just clear it out and load it fresh. Unsurprisingly, it still wants to put some support on the stem. It has still missed supporting the upper teeth, so once again paint on enforcers and blockers to get what I want. The last thing I need to talk about here is how to trick the slicer into letting us do a two-color print. If you want an orange stem on your orange pumpkin, that's fine. You're basically done. But I like to put a green stem on my pumpkin, and because of the way I did the step file, it's not that hard to look at each object individually in the slicer. The hard part is convincing it to actually output the G-code we need. This seems to change from time to time, and it has changed again. As you can see over on the right, I have the jack-o'-lantern and the two components of it as exported by FreeCAD. I can right-click on jack-o'-lantern and change the type. I'm just going to change it to negative volume. Now you can see we have just the stem of the jack-o'-lantern comically supported by organic supports to the correct height. If all I was printing was the stem, this would be weird but acceptable. But I don't want the support because at the time I start printing this G-code, there's going to be a jack-o'-lantern in the way. So I turn off supports and it remains hovering in the air as it should. But unfortunately, now I get an error that there is an object with no extrusions on the first layer. Unlike a warning, Prusaslicer will not even attempt to export the G-code if there's an error condition. I really wish there was a way to override that. It would make life a lot simpler for everybody, but there is not. I have submitted a feature request, so we'll see. Since the problem is the lack of an extrusion in the first layer, I'm going to have to go back into FreeCAD and create a sacrificial extrusion. So here we are back in FreeCAD. I'll create a geometric primitive, a box. I want it to be 1 mm by 1 mm and 0.4 millimeters high. The box, of course, appears underneath everything, so I'll just select it in the tree view and transform. I'll just pull it out a little bit so that it's in front of the jack-o'-lantern. Switching to the front view, I can see that it's in a good position. But of course it's created at z equals 0, as was the top of the jack-o'-lantern before I mirrored it below the plane to complete the shape. But I can look at the plane where I sliced the shape to make the bottom, and I see that the plane was placed at z equals negative 17 millimeters. So I'll come to the box placement position and set z to negative 17 millimeters, and that's exactly where I want it. I'll select the stem, select the box, and fuse them so that they'll show up as a single object in Prusaslicer. I select the jack-o'-lantern, select the fusion, and export as a step file. Back over to Prusaslicer. I need to delete everything that was in there, and now I'll load just the updated step file. Paint on the support enforcers for the teeth, and now back to the sliced view. Turn on supports from the build plate, and it looks like what I want. First I'll change the type of the fusion, leaving just the jack-o'-lantern. I can export this G-code, say as jack-o'-lantern.gcode. On second thought, I think maybe I should turn on the brim. There are some fairly thin spots on the bottom, and in the past, I've had a problem with features like that peeling up during printing. I suppose a great deal of twiddling with bed adhesion and Z-offset might fix that to perfection, or I can just turn on brim support and be done with it. I'll re-export with the brim. Now change the stem back into a part, change the jack-o'-lantern into a negative volume. I end up with my comically supported stem again. Turn off supports and note that instead of the error, I just have a warning of an empty layer between 0.4 and 41.2 millimeters. Very observant, yes there is. But it's only a warning, which means that it will now export the G-code. I'm going to also turn off the brim as there's very little point in a sacrificial slab of filament being well adhered. One final step. If I just export this G-code as is, there's going to be a little bit of a problem. The first layer of the stem is below the top of the jack-o'-lantern just by a couple of millimeters. The nozzle will easily fit into that space, but I need to hop over the already printed jack-o'-lantern in order to get there. So go into the filament settings, filament overrides, and set lift Z to a good, say, 4 millimeters just to make sure. Now I can export the G-code. This leaves one more problem. Once the jack-o'-lantern is printed and the filament is switched out, When it starts printing the G-code for the stem, the gantry may bump into the jack-o'-lantern when it prints the sacrificial slab. So I'm going to edit the stem.g code using VI. You can use whatever simple text editor you like. Since I have verbose comments turned on in Prusaslicer, I can quite easily find the first layer change annotation. I can see right below this is the part that is printing the tiny little box at the height of 0.4 millimeters. So just delete all of these lines up to but not including the next layer change annotation. Now when the G-code is printed, it's just going to skip that little box and go directly to the stem. I do need to still be careful because there are initialization steps that are going to want to home the hot end before it does anything. So I need to look out that all of that happens well out of the way of the jack-o'-lantern. In this case, I happen to know that the G28 command is first going to home X, then Y, and finally Z. This should keep everything well clear of the jack-o'-lantern. Looking down through the code, I can verify that after homing, it's going to lift the nozzle to the print height. Then it's going to further lift it 4 millimeters for the hop. Then it will move on the X and Y axis. That's exactly what I want to avoid a nasty collision. I've shown you how to accomplish the two-color print with the stock Prusaslicer. In the next video, I hack the Prusaslicer to make it do my bidding and perhaps yours. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video or found it useful, please like, subscribe, and share. If there's anything you'd like to see covered here, please let me know in the comments below.